Today on the Mrmaple Show Podcast, Matt and Tim talk to award-winning columnist for New York Times, garden editor for Martha Stewart, Margaret Roach.
Welcome to the Mrmaple Show. I'm Matt, and this is my brother Tim, and we are joined today by Margaret Roach.
Yeah, Margaret Roach, a recent 2024 Scott Garden and Horticultural Medal recipient, a 2018 George Robert White Medal of Honor recipient. Margaret Roach, a way to garden. She's got a podcast. She's got her blog. She's now a columnist for the New York Times on gardening, and the very first editor of garden editor of Martha Stewart Living magazine, and then she went up the ranks and became one of the editorial directors of Martha Stewart Living's Omni Media's magazines, books, and internet. So Martha Stewart, amazing person to work for, I'm sure. We've got Margaret Roach, and I'm so excited to have her today.
Margaret, welcome to the Mrmaple Show.
Hi, guys. How are you?
Oh, we're doing great. I'm just honored to have you. I feel like we just stepped up a little bit. We're doing pretty good. Thanks for joining us for the Mrmaple Show. We do these little podcasts, and we just have goofy plant conversations, and we're super honored to have you on here today.
Goofy plant conversations is my specialty. That's good. I like that.
I'd like to start out by just saying thank you to you for featuring us in an article this year. It's been huge for us. I know a lot of our listeners saw it because they already consume a lot of Mrmaple content, but my goodness, that was huge for us. And I just can't say thank you enough, especially for taking your time today, but for that article. That was so big for our business. And it was so fun to be featured in there along with the Buckholz deal. I know our staff out at Buckholz really appreciates everything, and they saw an uptick as well. I just can't say thanks enough for taking the time to focus on a small business like us.
And on top of that, I can't thank you enough when we were even smaller right. And you featured us on A Way to Garden. And that, being able to talk to you about plants and ginkgos and maples, when we were, much, much smaller, even more of a backyard operation than we are now. And I can't thank you enough for taking your time.
Well, you have a big debt of gratitude as a small business, that's for sure.
Well, I remember when Tony Avent, who I've known for more years than I should confess for me and Tony, he told me about you right from the start. And he said, you got to meet these guys. You got to meet these guys. Because Tony's been feeding me ideas for as long as I've known him, because I was always in the garden writing end and he was always in the plant, the nursery end and plant introduction end and so forth. And so he always would turn me on to exciting people that he knew, and you were among them. So
he's always been great to us too. He's like, these guys are crazy. I get it. They're crazy like I'm crazy when it comes to gardening. So we've always been kindred spirits for that. And
yes.
Another guy who's been really influential on us on the business side of things, we've always went and picked his brain a little bit. I think he's always kind of laughed at some of our like he was talking to me last time, and he was like, Matt, how do you make money doing a podcast? And I'm like, I don't know that we do, but we love doing it. And we love that for one day a week, people have a reason to think about what we do and maples that listen. So, whether our network is massive or small, it's fun to get people into that niche of it.
Right. And I've been doing a podcast weekly for about 15 years, and before they were sort of fashionable,
That's so cool. Yeah.
But, on the website, it used to be called a blog, but, a website for that long or a little longer. And I think it was never a money play. It was always a communications thing. It was always a community building thing, right? And sharing enthusiasm. And I think you guys have that, besides your expertise in plantsmanship and in propagation and in, the culture of your plants and pruning and this and that and the other thing. You also, I think, have the enthusiasm and you want to share it. And so I think that's the purpose it serves. And how can it not be good to build community, right?
I couldn't agree more. It's a big part of us is trying to build a community around it too, and having that fellowship of it. But 15 years, you have to be probably the OG That's got to be like the first garden podcaster, right? Their podcasts weren't hitting that hard back then. That's got to be one of the very first.
Yeah, well, it was started out it was on the local NPR station where I live in rural, it was in rural northwestern Connecticut. I live over the border in New York State. And so it was recorded and it was on their website. So maybe it wasn't technically called podcast,
but it was
very first weeks. But you know what I mean? Then there were all these apps were made to make it officially a podcast where they were syndicated as well. You know, with the Spotify and the Apple Podcast, which used to be iTunes, and I mean not iTunes. Was it called iTunes? What was it called? Before they turned it and made it Apple Podcasts, the Apple one. Anyway, you know Yeah, so yeah, it's been a long time. I've been doing it. Again, it started as a weekly public radio show and then evolved into, it's still on the local public radio station.
That's so cool.
Most of the listeners now, it's flopped. You know, most of the listenership is the podcast version versus the radio version.
I find that a lot of people are drawn to the gardening podcast now because, we do a lot of YouTube stuff too. And people that love the YouTube stuff love it. But I have a lot of people that say, I really love the gardening podcast because I can listen to them while I'm gardening. So it's like, it's a therapeutic. I'll just throw this on while I'm gardening and have a conversation in my head.
I hear the same thing. Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. That people like to listen to them while they're in the garden and so forth. Yeah.
So you're one of the world's best and amazing garden communicators. You've been doing it for years. You've done a great job of really just highlighting and talking to unique individuals all around the United States who are in their specialty. Where did your love of gardening come from?
Well, I had a grandmother who was a gardener. My mother's mother was a gardener. So I was around gardens as a kid. You know, there are pictures of me and my sister sitting on the outdoor patio furniture under this arbor of wisteria at her garden when we were tiny girls and things like that, you know. So I remember, and she always had vases of fresh cut flowers in the house in season and things as well. But it really came from more of kind of a need for what I now know would be called horticultural therapy, but I didn't know at the time what it was. I just knew that we had some difficulties in my family. My father had died. I was about 24. And then the next year when I was about 25, my mother, who was only 49 at the time, got early onset Alzheimer's disease. And we were a very small family. Mm-hmm. I have a younger sister, but we have no cousins, aunts, uncles, and our grandparents were all dead by then. So there was nobody. I was the eldest, you know, other than my mother who was ill. Mm-hmm. And so I had to move home to my family original home where I grew up, a suburban home in Queens County, kind of on Long Island, and sort of manage the situation. And so, you know, when you're in your 20s and suddenly you're living back at home and you have this gruesome situation going on, you need therapy. Mm-hmm. And so it was, a suburban house. I had a beautiful yard. And I don't know why, but I got a book about gardening, and maybe someone gave it to me. I don't even know. And I just started doing everything in it, you know, sowing seeds and pruning things and planting bulbs. And, you know, it was like, I had to be close to home, but I couldn't just watch TV all day or whatever. But I couldn't go too far away. I had a job at night. I worked as an editor at the New York Times, and someone else cared for my mother during the nights. But, you know, that was what I did during the day in the fair weather. So it was like, that was my way in. And I think for a lot of people, it's escapism of one form or another, whether there's a trauma going on or just meditating, sorting out the stress of the day, or just having fun listening to the birds. You know, I think there's a therapeutic aspect, don't you think?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. It's such a therapeutic thing. And it's almost impossible to garden and not have optimism in your heart, right? Because it's this, this is turning into something. I'm doing something that's going to make this landscape better. It's the optimism of, I bought a 1 gallon and I see a tree, you know, and you know, you're going to have a giant, beautiful tree one day. And so it's like, there's an optimism to it that's, it's infectious. You know, we all get defeated in the garden too sometimes, but it's fun because it's that part of escapism. And I find we have a lot of customers in high-end stress jobs that become big collectors, and it's their way to get away from the real part of the world that's hard. And I get that. It's nothing more relaxing.
Your story is not too far different from many of the pandemic gardeners who came home during the pandemic, were at home, trying to deal with these awful things going on with their lives, with people that they knew that were in the hospitals during the very first outbreaks of COVID, and then they found gardening, and it's crazy how when everything else shuts down, all of a sudden you kind of get back to your basics and you put your hands in the dirt and the soil, and it just becomes therapeutic. It's that escapism you're talking about, where you can go out there, relax. If you're into vegetables, plant a vegetable garden. If you're into, Japanese maples like us, it's just, you find these things that you can really be passionate about. It's
like the tables have turned. We get to interview you, but I know our story is kind of similar in that we grew up gardening for our grandmother. Right. She had 2 broke hips, so we would get off the school bus, and it was a little more directorial from her, because she couldn't get out and plant all these things. So for her, it was, hey Tim, take this small plant, put it over here, and put this over here. And so she was the landscape designer. We were just kind of the workers and the hands to get to everything she needed done. But that's where our love of gardening comes from as well. And she was very passionate about growing Japanese maples, and that kind of continued on. My dad started growing maples on his side of the family, and my grandmother on my mom's side of the family. But that passion and that love for actually getting out and gardening certainly comes through my grandmother. It's funny how so many grandmothers have passed that on too. It's so important.
And I think there's an imprint of the sort of the original plants that you knew, even if you didn't know really what they were when you were little or whatever. They're familiar. There's a familiarity. And I think the other thing that really about gardening that's so kind of magnetic, so attractive, is if you're a curious person, which I am, I want to know, and that's why I've been in journalism, which is, if you're going to be someone who interviews people all the time, you need to be curious, right? And so it kind of fits my personality. I want to know why, what, how did this happen? Where did that go? Lots of questions. And outside, boy, there's a lot going on that's mysterious and unknown. And, we can live our whole lives walking in and out and in and out and in and out, of the buildings we live in and whatever, go out to the car, drive to work, whatever, and never interact with it, or we can slow down.
Gardeners have to pay attention to detail. They have to stop and actually look at the world in real terms. It can't just be glossed over. You actually have to, what is eating this? What is going on here? What's happening here? And you have to live, in a more kind of paying attention role there. And so it's like, it's hands-on. It's, I don't know. We were joking about this the other day. It was like, I know kids say touch grass, but it's like touch dirt, right? It's like, it's even more therapeutic. Get people out gardening. That's just good for everybody.
Yeah. And I mean, there's so much complexity that, when I first started, again, it was near New York City and a suburban situation. And I didn't, I knew a few birds. I knew what a blue jay was and a robin and a few birds. And then eventually when my mother became too ill, and maybe 5 or so years later, and had to go live in a nursing home, we sold the house, my sister and I ended up getting this little funky place upstate a few hours, a weekend place. And, and like to take those same eyes and then like meet all these like new birds and new insects and new plants and new, like the natural world is just so vast, and to explore it with an open mind and to go ahead and get lost in it. I mean, it's definitely helped me a lot. Besides ending up being a career thing, it just has helped me a lot to find my way through the hardest times in my life so far. So, I mean, I think it's great therapy.
Yeah, I agree. I could agree more. I talked to you a lot about our story, but I was at a big loss. I got laid off. Things were going rough. Yeah. Moved back home, and I said, what if I just start grafting some of these trees Dad's doing? Maybe I'll just do this. Maybe I won't work for anybody else anymore.
And look what happened.
I'll just do this. So it's funny what gardening can do for you. I was looking for a thing to be happy about at the time, and it's so much fun to find things that can Yeah, I guess I'm 16 years into doing this full time, but I still find things to get excited about every day. So it's like, and gardening there's always those fun things. It's funny you mentioned about your mother and the plants you grow back then. It's almost like comfort foods, because I think back to things my grandmother grew, and those are like comfort plants to me, like comfort foods. It's like familiarity with them, and then they're relaxing plants. If I had that time with them back then, it's almost like a relationship with my grandmother. I still have plants. My grandfather, he passed away when I was 6, and I have these giant elephant ears that my wife hates that are outside of our house, and I'll never get rid of them because I have pictures of me standing beside my grandfather measuring how tall I am with his juiced up elephant ears that got as tall as this little 4-year-old. And so my wife every year complains because they block our whole driveway. Like, I've got these elephant ears that are the same ones he had, and they kind of block out our front porch, so I have to kind of get out there and cut them back. But I'll never quit gardening with those because they're my comfort plant in many ways. They remind me of family.
Right. Well, and I have from my grandmother, who she probably died when I was in my teens. My mother's mother, again, the first gardener that I knew, she had downsized. Eventually her husband died, and she had downsized and moved to an apartment near us, and she had brought with her house plants. Obviously she couldn't bring her garden. And this one house plant called Clivia, which kind of looks like a giant amaryllis, like strappy leaf type thing, but it keeps the leaves all year long. It's evergreen, unlike the amaryllis where they wither part of the year. It doesn't go dormant. And it was a big plant. It used to, when she died, it became ours, and so it sat on the sort of sideboard where the TV set was in the TV room in our house. So I knew this plant like my whole life. First at her house, then at our house, and then when we had to sell the house, my mother had to go in the nursing home, I adopted the plant. So this plant, it must be 80 plus. I've had the plant for 45, 50 years, and I knew it many years before that. And again, it was hers, and it was a big thing then. When we got it, it was already big, so I'm assuming she had it a long time before we got it. So, this is probably an 80 or 80 plus year old houseplant. It's now many of these very, very large. Oh, wow. They're in like 18-inch pots or something. I can barely lift the pots. That's how, they're massive plants. And I have a whole mudroom in the back of the house that's filled with them, that's just all grandma's clivias or the offsets of her clivias, and I've given them to people and stuff like that. But it's just, like you said, there's something about that's legacy, that's the provenance of them. I mean, that's irreplaceable, right? Oh, for sure. You spoke about a little bit about how you got into gardening and how that whole thing started, and you were into journalism before. How did you make that transition into this beautiful career of informing people about horticulture? How did the horticulture and the journalism come to meet? How did that start out for you? I started out with a clerical job at the New York Times, what used to be called a copy girl or a copy boy. It was like you were the the clerical help in the newsroom, and then I got a promotion to a clerk, and then I got a promotion to a news assistant. There was a hierarchy kind of thing, and you worked your way through. And around that time, there was a sexual discrimination suit by some of the women who had worked there a very, very long time against the newspaper, asking for, equal opportunity, equal pay and things like that for some of the more senior women. And so it became a class action suit. And long story short, even us younger women who were new and in much lower positions got put into this class action. And part of the settlement was that they kind of they had to kind of mix up and reintegrate and change up the balance of who was in which departments and who got what opportunities and all kinds of other things. And so a lot of us young female employees ended up in oddball departments. I ended up in the sports department.
I'm glad you got back to gardening somehow. Let
me just explain that I am not a jock. Not good. The guys that I worked with, I was an editor, copy editor, and the guys that I worked with on the copy desk, they made me a button for my shirt that said, "I hate pro football."
Jeez. Perfect.
They just tease me. I mean, all the time, I was good at copy editing.
Right.
I wasn't into it. Right. And I had this hobby brewing, of the gardening, and I kept saying to myself, can I make that my subject? And so I started asking around, and there was no way that was going to happen at the Times, but there was an opportunity at another newspaper on Long Island, actually, a Newsday newspaper, a big paper on Long Island, which was a big garden area.
Yeah.
And so I ended up a few years later taking an opportunity there, but it was really because I knew that I was I wasn't necessarily going to end up in a subject I loved. They offered me something in financial news. Again, I could have done it, but it didn't interest me. It didn't speak to me.
I'm such a proponent of that. Like I worked in banking and hated what I did.
Yeah.
I worked in a cubicle filing paperwork, and I'm the biggest proponent you'll ever meet of follow what you love, because like why not? Like don't stay in the sports section if you hate sports. Like it's so cool that you got to take that leap and get out there into the parts you love, and I just think we feel so much more fulfilled for it. So that's cool that your story's kind of taken that leap, and now it's led to this amazing career of horticulture journalism. And
a lot of the skill set from different parts of your life, infuse them together and apply them to the other parts of your life. You know what I mean? There were useful skills from all those past experiences.
It's crazy now how you went from being a sports, someone working in sports at the New York Times to then, you're working at Newsday, and then, Martha Stewart, sees your work and enjoys it.
Right.
And then you become the first garden editor of Martha Stewart Living Magazine. Fast forward to today, and now you're writing garden columns for the New York Times.
Right. It's one big circle. It is. It's all very fitting. It's funny. It's like good closure. I was pretty much retired, and then the pandemic happened, and the Times didn't have a garden writer anymore. A lot of papers don't have them anymore, the full-time garden writers anymore. And of course, as you pointed out earlier, everyone was gardening. So one of the editors knew about my work and knew me and called me up and said, could you do this? And we've done 5 seasons altogether. I do about 35 weeks out of the year, something like that, 40 weeks out of the year that I write a column. And we just are winding down the 5th such season. So since, so
that's incredible.
so much for retirement.
So what was, we talked about, these generational plants that, people pass down, but there's also those imprints of those plants that are some of the first plants you plant in your garden. And I read somewhere that, one of the first plants you planted in a garden was a Japanese umbrella pine.
That was the first thing, literally the first thing I planted. And it was the first one of the first things I planted in remaking the front yard garden at my mother's, my childhood home in Queens. I do not know why. I have no idea how it happened. I found out about a conifer nursery on Long Island at that time, and in the metro area, actually, at that time, metro New York area, in New Jersey, and in Long Island, and elsewhere near New York. There were a lot of specialty nurseries, with like real plants in the ground, especially woody plants, a lot of plant breeding and selection and stuff. There were some pretty eminent, kind of places. And someone turned me on to it. I don't know who it was. And I had all these, I started throwing out all the junk that was in the front yard and put on all these unusual conifers.
That's a pretty high level first plant. I
have no idea. So
super collector.
The Cytopodes was this one plant that I had. And just before the moving van, again, after we sold the house and we were leaving the childhood home, I got possessed and dug it up. It had been in the ground a couple of years. It was probably up to my nose or something. And I dug it back up, put it in a bushel basket, one of those, in those days, the fruit baskets at the market, all the baskets were those, wooden sort of slat kind of baskets, a real peach basket or whatever. Put it in a bushel basket, put it in the back of the moving van, brought it up here, which is 120 miles north, didn't know what zone it was, didn't know anything about where I was going, dug a hole and put it in the ground. And I can look at it right outside my window. It's much taller than my house now. But the poor thing, which by the way doesn't really like transplanting, I did it twice.
Nice.
And knowing nothing. And it survived. So it's kind of like a partner, I mean, and most of the things I have here, that was one that I got at, again, like maybe chest high, and it had gotten to nose high by the time I moved it again. And now it's, 30 feet. But most of the things I got, the more that I got into gardening and got to know other gardeners and stuff, they came to me in little, like with a little plastic baggie of the soil, the ball of soil on the root, and they were like a grafted cutting or rooted cutting, like 6 inches tall and stuff. And now they're mature trees. I mean, my whole place, I remember planting them with like a trowel,
right?
And they're massive things, massive. I have these golden yews, these what is it? It's a Taxus repandens aurea, I think. They came to me as I could hold it in my hand. Each one, I have 4 of them, and they're 15 feet across each one now, and it's just hysterical. It's so funny to think of what it was and what it is, and that's the great thing about investing in your woody plants early. Getting them in the ground early, because as you guys know, it makes all the difference.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Speaking of, you're talking about some tips for, maybe beginners whenever it comes to gardening. I know you're you're probably the world expert on gardening. You interview people daily on this.
I'm good at interviewing experts. I'm not the world's expert. I'm good at interviewing experts.
Well, what are some tips that you would have for a beginner gardener?
Well, definitely, I think the thing that I just said about the woody plants, they take time. Herbaceous things are going to, catch on in a minute. So get your foundational things, your structural sort of key players in the design, whatever that is. Get those in the ground as early as you can. I think the thing that I didn't understand at all, and thankfully I had friends who were garden designers, who came and visited, used to come and visit sometimes. And when I first got here, when I was first making the garden, the driveway used to come all the way up alongside the house, so that outside the windows on one side of the house, the east side of the house, you'd kind of park the car almost right next to the house, as is true in a lot of places, right? And so my friend Charles and I, they were visiting, and we were standing making supper one evening during their visit, and we're stirring the pots of whatever and standing next to each other at the stove and looking out the window, and without breaking a smile or anything, deadpan, he just says, he looks up and he says, "Do you like looking at your car door?" And I was like, "What?" And he's like, "Do you like looking at your car door? Is that your idea of like a nice view?" And he then said, we turned off the stove, and he said, "Let's go look or walk around the house and look out all the windows that are the key windows where you spend a lot of time, like the window from your desk, the window from, where you sit and read a book, and, that kind of thing." And he said, "You don't design a garden from outside. You design a garden by looking out the window, because most of the time you'll get to appreciate your work inside out."
Oh, that's beautiful.
So make axial views, make yourself pictures to appreciate, to pat yourself on the back and appreciate and enjoy all the other days when you're not out in the garden, right?
That's some of the best advice for beginners I've ever heard. That's great.
It was mind blowing. Well, the next week I got guys to get rid of the driveway and put a big magnolia across from where there had been a car.
That's cool.
That's awesome. But talk about,
big changes.
Big changes coming from dinner conversation.
And he just was so funny, because he didn't, he didn't yell at me or anything, like call me stupid, but I was I felt so stupid, and it was like, I just got it, I just really got it. It was great.
I think that's a great way to look at gardening. And, most of the time people are going to be appreciating their gardening from inside. And then when they go outside,
yes.
I like people to have little rooms. I like people to be able to have spots where they can sit down and enjoy the garden in the garden as well. But in that same idea, you'll have a bench. That's your viewpoint. And
exactly a focal point, something to bring you from point A to point B. Exactly.
So it's probably a cliche question. You're probably tired of it, but I got to ask you about your time with Martha Stewart. You probably get asked about that a million times, but it's a fascinating thing and a huge thing. Can you talk about your time working for her?
God, it was a lot of, I guess it was about 15 or so years. And it was, when the magazine was just beginning to grow, and then we became a public company, and,
sure.
whatever.
She was blowing up like crazy during that time too.
Lots and lots of different businesses. And, it was hectic. So it was always really hectic. It was very creative. It was very interesting to be in. It was almost like a salon or studio. We had all these like expert cooks who were the food editors, chef, almost like chef type people, and recipe developers, and, people who were crafters, and people who were decorators. And, our editors were people who actually, they didn't just write about the stuff, they did the stuff. And, you just walk into the room, the craft department, and you could just spend hours just watching the different people inventing things, and again, or going to the test kitchens, and what they had, the ideas that they had, and what food they were making. I mean, it was just so amazing, and that credits her, because she really believed that you have to foster creativity, right? And her motto was "Learn something new every day." Martha's motto, and just to, like, again, speaking to curiosity and asking a lot of questions. And we think alike on that score. And her way of saying it was "Learn something new every day." Just keep being curious, keep asking, keep finding out, keep trying new things, keep tasting new things, keep doing new things. And so I mean, it was really, really hectic, really, really intense, but also this incredible, like a big studio of artists, that it just was so fun to be around.
That sounds super inspirational. And what a fun way to be inspired every day. But also it sounds like, you get the right people doing the right things. It's hard not to be inspired. Like if you have those experts on that level, it brings the whole game up too, because you're like, well, this guy's really good. I've got to make sure I'm awesome. It sounds amazing. That's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I remember one of the first stories I did when I was the garden editor in the beginning, and I said, we used to have these meetings to kind of, with different departments, to, brainstorm ideas for each issue of the magazine. And I said, well, why don't we do a story about winter squash? And everybody looked at me like, what are you talking about? Like acorn squash, or, because in the market, right? Like at that time, this is a long time ago, more than 20 years ago, it didn't sound very interesting. And so I went and got a seed catalog and showed some pictures of some of the people I knew who were collectors of heirloom squash varieties of, all kinds of weird shapes and colors and, sizes. And anyway, and I ended up calling them and having them, and during harvest time, ship us all these different types of heirloom squashes and pumpkins and stuff. And I remember when the boxes came and we opened them, and the whole place, like everybody, the food people, the craft people, like everybody was completely riveted, and it just worshipped these beautiful creatures, these squash, and it was so fun to that was the kind of thing, like we all turned each other on to an angle of our worlds.
I think that's so interesting. And for what you do too, like what I'm drawn to, and kind of, you talked about with us trying to build a community, but we're really drawn to the stories of the people. And so it's so interesting that you get to the stories behind the horticulture, behind the plants. And that's something we like to, we're very maple centric, obviously, but we like to talk about, Yano-san or Peter Gregory or some of our favorite people that have grown plants, and then kind of just dive into the stories of the people behind the plants. So it's like, why did this guy introduce this? But I think it's so interesting from your perspective, because you go through everybody's stories in horticulture, and I'm sure there's some just amazing stories out there through the years, because the people are so fascinating behind the horticulture. Such a big part of it. It's absolutely true.
So that was a fun time, but intense also,
I can imagine.
and also the city and the corporate, you know what I mean? I mean, skyscraper and
high-paced,
to the city every
fast-paced.
day. Yeah.
I know we had some younger people who worked for us, and I said, we were getting an article written on us by Margaret Roach, a former editor of Martha Stewart Living magazine, and they were just so taken back. They're like, that's amazing.
No, they asked if we could get Snoop Dogg and Martha on the podcast. So if you can make that,
They did. I think
what the younger people asked.
I think they were impressed that we knew somebody who knew Martha Stewart, who knew Snoop Dogg.
That was a big part of it.
Yeah, chain of command. I know. It's funny. It's funny. Yeah. She's like I told you. She said, learn something new every day. And look at her. She's at the Olympics, and she's at the this, and she's at
Right.
that.
It's inspirational. It's super inspirational. It's so cool.
Yeah, I'm just so thankful for you for all that you do in inspiring people to garden, inspiring people to get out there and try different things, because you're always putting in a different angle of gardening. I mean, we're woody ornamentals, and you definitely have some woody ornamental articles, but you also go in and you talk about native plants. You also go in and you talk about planting for bees, planting for different things.
Challenge people to think different ways about it.
Yeah, and really look at all aspects of gardening, which I think people don't do enough. They think gardening is one specific thing, and to us, gardening is Japanese maples. But
we get out of our lane a little bit. We explore.
Yeah,
Ginkgos.
It challenges people to get outside their box and really enjoy gardening in different ways.
I couldn't agree more. We're just so fascinated with it. Do you have some of your favorite stories over the years of different things you kind of got to? I mean, in many ways, you put many people onto us, but is there a lot of people that you got to show to the world that really stood out to you over the years? Because I feel like you've put a lot of people on to a stage that they never would have gotten to had you not kind of decided to focus and talk about them a little bit. And I know that was a big deal for us. You certainly turned a lot of new people onto us.
I think I've always had I've had two things that since I became a gardener, nearly 40 years ago, that I've had an interest in were native plants, even though it wasn't fashionable at the time, and seeds, especially organic seeds, and organic seed breeding and organic. Pretty early on, when I got serious into gardening, I went down those two. It's funny. My one of my devices, it thought I was talking to it, and it made a noise. Siri made a noise. Sorry about that. Isn't that weird when that happens? Where Big Brother's watching
Talks to you
us.
randomly.
I heard this noise next to me. I was like, what?
They wanted to hear about the seeds. They're like, tell us more.
Yeah. So those two subjects, organic seeds, especially organic seed breeding, I tend to know for many, many years a lot of people in that sort of subculture. And in the last recent decades, as we probably all know, the seed world has become a world of patented it's become a world of intellectual property, seed varieties have become owned.
Right.
And the owners of something some horrible thing 60% of all the genetic material, the germplasm of seeds currently is owned by 4, and they're pharmaceutical chemical companies.
That's wild.
Primarily. It's really become where it's no longer in the public domain at all, or, kind of available to everyone. Anyway, I've watched that change, and that's been something that I'm always happy having, again, known some of the longtime breeders in the sort of organic part of the movement, which is not that part of the movement, the commercial, industrial, conventional, big ag seed breeding kind of thing. It's the opposite. I love shining a light on those people that keep at it, even though there's not millions to be made, even though there's so many obstacles, because they believe in like, for instance, all the genetics of kale that needs to be expressed in all its diversity because they believe in the magic and the history that it represents and the future feeding of people that it can represent. And I just said kale, but it could be tomatoes or it could be carrots. So I love shining a light on, and I have long relationships, cherished relationships with a lot of people in that world. So that's always been really fun. And then the native plant thing, maybe 32, 33, I think it was about that long, around 1990. So maybe 30 something years ago, I was working on a book with a friend about native plants, and we traveled around the country to meet sort of some of the pioneerish kind of people. And a lot of those people also then, I followed them, and then the people they mentored, the next generation, and the organizations they founded. And so I love shining a light on those because I feel like I have history with them or their descendants, so to speak. Yeah. And I think that's true of anything. I mean, you spoke to the fact that in your family there was an interest in these plants that you cherish.
Yeah. It's
from a long time ago. And it's a provenance. Again, I'll use that word, So
we've got heirloom tomatoes, but we've also got heirloom maples in our family. Absolutely.
And in the seed world, that's really true. So those are two things that I always love when I can, do something about someone who's doing the good work in one of those fields, especially.
I love it. I really appreciate you hopping on here today, just having a conversation with us. We're out of our league with you being on our show. I'm not going to lie. I'm so excited to have you on here. It's just an honor that you would even take your time to do this. We're just kind of feeling pretty cool today to have you on. So I really appreciate you taking your time to do this.
Yeah. And I really appreciate, getting featured on a Way to Garden podcast about the maples. Whenever we came in, we did a podcast with you, and then I appreciate you featuring us about the ginkgos years ago and featuring us in the New York Times.
I can tell you all of our employees can say thank you for this year because we've had a great year. We employ 32 people here at Mrmaple and 16 at Buckholtz, and we all owe you a debt of gratitude. There was a significant increase in business, and we were able to give that back and do some raises and stuff even here because of that. So we've had a phenomenal year, and we definitely can tell you thank you for a big part of our spring just killing it. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Well, thank you guys, because I always learn so much. That's the reason, that's what keeps me going, is when I get to interview people, I learn a lot, and here I have all these Japanese maples that I've had and Korean maples as well, that I've had for some of them 15 or more years, but I have them in pots because I'm in a cold climate. I have them in giant pots, and I wheel them on a hand truck into the garage, into the barn in the winter and so forth. And I learned so much about, here they're like I've known them, but you've given me more knowledge of them, more understanding of them.
Hey, the offer's still there. You told us to hold off on our thank you package till the fall. So you be thinking about what cool plant we need to send you, because we really appreciate everything.
We do have some Acer pseudosubodium hybrids that we've been developing. That
might be a good choice.
Might be a good choice to get you to trial a few of our unique hybrid of Acer pseudosubodium, those Korean maple hybrids that we've been doing for cold climates.
Some reds, things like that. Might be interesting. But yeah, think about what you'd like. We're going to be sending something out this fall, and we just can't thank you enough. You're a cool person. You're a fun person. You get me fired up thinking about plants. And again, just super humbled and honored that we could get you to be on our show. It's pretty cool.
And congratulations on having done such a great job with the business. And like Tony said you would. So Tony Avent said you would. So
I appreciate it. Thanks so much for being on here today, Margaret.
Thanks, Margaret.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
So guys, thanks for watching today. Really humbled and honored to have such a big deal on our channel. Really cool to have Margaret Roach on here. Sometimes we just get lucky. It's really cool that she's done so many things for us. I feel super blessed. In her article, she said, one thing I was laughed about, she said, Matt and Tim are like, one of the things that started out was like, if you could manifest a destiny, I'm like, we're just blessed. There ain't nothing I dreamed into existence here. We're super blessed to be able to do this. Super blessed to be able to have people like Margaret on our channel too.
Yeah, that's for sure. To have friends like her and Tony Avent that would recommend us and write amazing articles for us. I mean, it was her putting us on Robin Hood Radio.
Right.
We're in the NPR. Talking about ginkgos, where Joe Lample heard us and put us on Growing a Greener World.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a small world in gardening. And it's awesome to have good friends.
Guys, if you hadn't already, make sure to give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. You can subscribe to the Mrmaple Show podcast on almost any podcast platform, so look us up on there. We do air these on YouTube as well, so check out the Mrmaple Show on YouTube. The video components of these go up Sunday evenings at 8 p.m. Eastern, so make sure to watch the videos there if you'd like to see more. And we put out 7 days a week content on that Mrmaple Show as well.
Y'all, thanks so much for listening. Take care.
God bless you.
And have a great day.